All right. And a couple of people just came on. Please, in the chat box, so you can get your training hours, put down your name. And if you've got a partner with you or a spouse, put their name in there too, and include the jurisdiction, the county that you're with, so you can get those training hours. So I'm Josh Kroll. I'm with the North American Council on Adoptable Children, and I'm located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I have been helping people with this adoption tax credit since 2004. I am not a tax expert, but I know a lot for someone who isn't a tax expert. So just give me 1 second here. Shari Hopkins, there we go. Thank you. I was getting a little background noise out of you there. So we're going to cover the adoption tax credit. The other things we're going to cover tonight really quick is claiming children as dependents, as well as the last thing is the recovery rebate credit. And that will be useful for folks who have fostered new children in 2021, not just children who have been adopted. So stick around to the end, because that will also be some useful information if you took a new placement in 2021. So this isn't as complicated as all of this, but we're going to go through it. I'm going to hopefully make this make a lot of sense to folks. So today we're going to cover the basic information about the adoption tax credit. I'm going to cover the years, basically 2021 going, it'll be 2022, because the information is pretty much the same for next year, but going as far back as 2012. It's more complicated the further back you get, but we'll cover that. Claiming children as dependents, and as I said, the recovery rebate credit. So to be eligible for the federal adoption tax credit, you have to adopt a child. And I know this sounds crazy. Arnie was just down in Georgia, and I remember doing a training down at that same conference about a decade ago, and someone asked, well, what about for long-term foster care? This credit has adoption in its name. You have to adopt a child, and it can't be your stepchild. It has to be someone other than your stepchild. The child must be under 18 years old at the time of adoption. It's going to be more complicated if the child turns 18 during the year, but let's say I adopt a child that's 17 and they turn 18 during the year. The IRS forms don't handle that well, but they totally are eligible for this credit in that situation. So don't think that, by the time you file your taxes, the child being 18 disqualifies them. It's about their age at the time of adoption. You have to have a modified adjusted gross income below a certain income. And you either have to have the state determine the child as special needs or have qualified adoption expenses. Children who are determined as special needs by the state qualify for the maximum amount of the adoption tax credit, even if you didn't pay anything for the adoption. So this nice grid here covers the amount, the year in the left column that you're claiming the credit, the maximum amount of credit in the second column for that year. You'll see there's a cost of living adjustment, so it keeps going up and up. And it's a lot bigger jump this year than it has been because of the inflation's up. This third column, that's the lower income limit. If in the year you're claiming the credit, your income, your modified adjusted gross income is up below this amount, you qualify for the full amount of the credit. If it's between this amount and the fourth column, you get a partial. If it's over the amount in the fourth column, you get nothing. This amount of credit we're talking about is per child. So if I adopted 2 kids in 2021 and they were considered special needs, I would get $14,440 for each child, and that would work out to $28,880. Now you have 6 years in which to try and use this credit, and I'm going to explain how that all works. It currently is not a refundable credit. So your ability to use it is going to be just going to depend on your finances. The one thing also I want to stress on this, if you are under this income, like I work in child welfare, I'm under this income all the time, every year. But I talked years ago to a family in Kansas, and they adopted 4 girls, and they sold their the family farm that year. That's capital gains for selling that property spiked them that year over the upper income. They got no credit. They lost out on over $40,000 in adoption credit because they didn't know. If the family had known ahead of time, they would have made sure the two actions had not happened in the same year. Ideally, adopt one year, sell the property the next year, and have $40,000 to help with whatever taxes they would owe on it. So if you are if you're getting close to this on income, or you're over it, see if you can get under it, or if you have something that might, like if you had to cash out a 401k or something like that, and that increases your income for that 1 year, or you're selling, property, try not to do that in the year you're adopting. Not everybody has that control, but I'm trying to inform you so that if you have any sort of control like that, you don't do that. So that's sort of the nuts and bolts on how much the credit is and the income limits. So the income test and the filing status, there's two things. The first is, as I sort of explained in that example, the income test is only applied in the year you're claiming the credit. So like I said in that example, ideally that family would have adopted the 4 kids, had over $40,000 in adoption tax credit, and then the next year they would have that carry forward. They could be over income. They could make $1 billion the next year, and they would still have that $40,000 in credit, because the income test is only applied in the year that you're claiming the credit. And if you're adopting from the foster care system, which I think most of you are, that's generally going to be the year that you finalize the adoption. Now, the other one that comes up, and it's come up more and more, is the issue of your married filing, or your filing status. If you are married, you have to file jointly unless you're truly separated. And you would be separated. This is straight from the IRS instructions for Form 8839. You're separated if you lived apart from your spouse during the last 6 months of the year, the eligible child lived in your home more than half the year, you provided over half the cost of keeping up your home. If that's not the case, you have to file jointly that year that you're claiming the credit. The next year, you can go back to filing separately. And if you have any carry forward, you just split that carry forward however you want between the two parents. If one parent makes a lot more than the other and they're going to be able to use the most of it, you probably want it mostly or all of it to go to that parent. But if not, split it however you want. It just can't be whatever's left over. You can't, claim between the two tax filers more than that total amount that's left. If you were truly separated, then the parent that's claiming that child and claiming the adoption tax credit has to file as head of household, not married filing separately. And that's in the year you claim the credit. The most common I've heard is folks who are doing like a loan forgiveness, and they're separating the incomes and reporting just the one for whoever's doing the loan forgiveness for, like public service loan forgiveness, often like teachers, for like student loans. So they're doing them separately. There should be other ways to try and document that one person's income, but you'd probably want to talk with your loan service provider, but don't lose out on potentially $14,000 or more in adoption tax credit because you want to file jointly or separately. It's probably, it all depends on your specific situation. It's probably less cost effective to forego this credit and continue filing separately. Remember, after year 1, you can go back to filing separately. So,
Josh, you have one question in the chat. Is this a one-time credit or every year until the child turns 18? Is the question that's in the chat. Sure. You might just want to double back and take care and make sure that's clear.
You claim it once and you use it until you use it up or 6 years have passed. After 6 years, if you haven't used it all up, it just disappears. If you use it up in 1 year, it's done and over with. This is not like a child tax credit that you get each and every year. There are some states, Maryland, to my knowledge, is not one of them, but Arnie was just in Georgia. Georgia actually has a state credit that is each and every year until the child turns 18 related to adoption. I'm not aware that Maryland has such a credit. So This is, you claim it once. And when I get into explaining how the credit works, you're going to get a lot more information about that. So, so that's income test and filing status. When to file for adoption credit. I just have a slide up just in case. For international adoptions, it's the year that the adoption is final. For special needs adoption without expense, it's in the year the adoption is final. For private domestic adoptions, if anybody was doing, a private domestic adoption, it's going to either be the year it's final, or if it's not final, the year after the expenses were paid. If anybody's in that situation, we can go over it. But real quick, like if I was working with a private agency and, I paid them $2,000 to start the process in 2020, and I still haven't been matched with the child, or I've been matched with the child, but I haven't finalized yet. That $2,000 I paid in 2020, I could claim on my 2021 taxes because I had paid those expenses, and I can claim them the year after if I have not finalized. So, but anybody in that situation, feel free to reach out to me directly. My contact information will be on the last slide. So, so how do you know if your child's special needs? I mentioned this a few times, that there's this thing, special needs, and that this is the key to being able to claim the full credit without having to pay any expenses. And the answer just basically comes down to, do you get adoption subsidy for the child? If you get adoption subsidy, even if it's not a great amount, just anything, you get adoption subsidy for the child. Or if you even get a $0 subsidy payment, but you have an adoption subsidy agreement with the state, and it provides Medicaid or reimbursement of non-recurring adoption expenses like attorney fees, that will be enough for the IRS to consider it as special needs. So if you have an adoption assistance agreement with the state, that means the state has determined the child as special needs. It doesn't have to be a disability. It can be an older child. It can be a sibling group. It does not necessarily have to be a disability. And the reason it matters, you get to claim the full amount of the credit, even if you didn't pay anything for the adoption. So this is straight from the instructions. I'm not going to read you everything because it's kind of painful to read. But in this example, they're talking about a sibling group of 3. Their ages 10, 8, and 6. They never actually mention in here anything about a disability. It says here, determined it'd be difficult to place the children for adoption without providing assistance to the adoptive family because of the age and sibling relationship of the children. Says here, agency A provided the adoptive parents with monthly subsidy payments on behalf of each child. The adoption assistance agreements entered into between agency A and the adoptive parents are evidence that state B has determined that Mark, Rachel, and Janet are children with special needs and may be used to support the adoptive parents' claim to the adoption tax credit. Last sentence here, their adoptive parents may claim an adoption tax credit for each child, even if the adoptive parents paid no qualifying adoption expenses, if all of the requirements of the credit are met. That's related to like our, that's not having anything to do with special needs. It's just, are you married, filing jointly, etc. So right here in the instructions, it says the adoptive parents may claim an adoption tax credit for each child, even if they paid no qualifying expenses. And up here, it says the adoption assistance agreement is evidence that the state determined the children as special needs. So just want to really hit on home on that. If you're doing your own taxes and you're filing for this credit and you get adoption assistance, you're going to check special needs. When it asks for disabled, don't click disabled. That's about kids being over 18 when they're adopted. When it asks for expenses, you put in the full amount. For those of you that hire folks, what you're going to want to do is the same thing. You want to tell them, I have adoption assistance for them, so they're considered special needs. This is what you need to tell them here. The single most important thing you need to know is the special needs qualify for the full amount of the credit, regardless of expense paid for the adoption. And so what's going to happen if you have a tax preparer and they don't believe you, you need to show them what line 5 is where it asks for expenses. And the instructions are really clear. It says, if you adopted a U.S. child with special needs and the adoption became final in 2021, enter on line 5. Remember, this is where it's asking for qualified adoption expenses. And I'm just going to skip the first 2 bullet points and say, if you did not claim any adoption credit for the child in a prior, because that's generally the case for most adoptions from foster care, you enter $14,440 on line 5, even if your qualified adoption expenses for this child were less than 14,440, and even if you didn't have any qualified adoption expenses for this child. So there are only about 10,000 of these tax credits filed a year. Not 10,000, sorry, 100,000. 100,000 of these filed a year. So if you have a tax preparer who doesn't believe you, you're going to have to be pushy and say, hey, read this. If they don't want to read this, if they're not willing to read it, or they don't understand it, which I had a really unfun talk with the tax preparer recently who was trying to, I felt like I was under cross-examination. I watched some, trials of late, thought I was under cross-examination. And I'm like, have you read the instructions? And she got very offended by that. I'm just like, this is where it is. It's in the instructions. Read this. Tell me what you don't understand about this. If you have someone who won't read it or doesn't understand it, you might need to look for a new tax preparer. If you do your own taxes, you can still do your own taxes. You don't need to hire someone to do this. The reality is almost everybody in the last couple of years, I talked to one guy still doing things by hand. Almost everybody, whether you're doing them yourself or you're hiring someone, is just plugging information into the prompts and software. That's really all that's going on. So if you felt comfortable doing that before, this is not that hard. You can still do it. I will say this though, this year there's a delay in accepting things, and I have seen some really weird stuff with some of those forms. One person was using H&R Block and it wasn't using any of the credit, even though it should have. And there was a mess up with the line 1115 credit work, or line 1115, line 15 credit limit worksheet. And then someone else was having some weird stuff. I can't remember what software they were using. It might have been TurboTax, but I can't recall exactly. So there's something that got messed up with doing things this year, and it all has to do with the child tax credit interaction, is my guess. But I digress a little bit. Generally, not a problem. And the reality is, I think folks are going to have that same problem if they go and hire someone. So anybody that's filing this year, I'm happy to double check your 1040 and your 8839 and make sure things are making sense and processing right, because I have seen some mess ups with the software. So I'm going to move on. So you're going to hear stories. People hear stories from the good old days or not so fun days. I mean, they were good because when the tax credit was refundable, which I'll explain sort of in a few minutes, it was great. Families really benefited from this, and that was awesome. But at the same time, the IRS was trying to prevent fraud, so they were requiring documentation. You do not need to send documentation to the IRS. I mean, I still see it showing up on like Facebook groups and stuff like that, that people are like, oh, I heard that I need to send in this paperwork, but I'm not sure how to do that. You don't do that. You can e-file the returns, keep records for your own records in case the IRS asks for it, but you do not need to send it to the IRS unless requested. This is what you should document. This is what you should keep your records. And these you should keep anyways, because they're really important documents. So for all domestic adoptions, it's going to be the court decree. That's the thing from generally the county that shows that you adopted the child. This is your someplace called certificate of adoption, but it basically the thing from the court that shows that you adopted the child. For anybody doing international adoptions, a foreign adoption decree translated into English, a Hague adoption certificate, and some visas will work. If you're in that situation and you want to double check, get a hold of me. I need to know which country to know if it's Hague or not. There's slightly different rules for Hague and non-Hague countries. For special needs adoption, this should be the majority of you, you need proof that the state has determined the child has special needs, and that is one thing only. That's your adoption assistance agreement. Some states have in the past issued like a letter saying they certify the child with special needs. But for the IRS at this point, that adoption assistance agreement should be all that you ever need. And that's a very important document. When folks were needing that, it was driving states nuts. People like, because families were asking for it to get the adoption tax credit. And the state's like, why didn't you keep a hold of that? It's an important document. It's technically a contract. So keep a copy of that, because sometimes that contract is useful when things happen when I do my adoption subsidy work. Because that's the other stuff that I do for NACAC, because I provide information about adoption subsidy. For private, domestic, and international adoptions that are not determined special needs, shouldn't be any of you keep copies of bills, receipts, proof of payment to show that you had qualified adoption expenses and that you paid them. So not only that you have an invoice from someone, but if you have any bank records or credit card transactions showing that you actually paid that person, that would be great. I mean, I could just generate a whole bunch of invoices for every single one of you that you never pay me. So that's why at that time the IRS was looking at proof of payment too, because they're worried about fraud. Once again, these are not things that you need to do at this point. But if you're adopting from foster care, you want to keep these anyways, that court decree and adoption assistance agreement, because they're very vital records that you should be keeping anyways. Also, if the IRS ever asks you for that documentation, I would highly recommend reaching out to me. One, it helps me know how often they might be asking and try and get a sense of what might have triggered them asking that. But I can also try and help answer questions to the best of my ability. I have seen the request, especially in the refundable years. That's that page. So now I'm going to explain how the adoption tax credit works. So the first thing is you need to claim the credit. We talked about this earlier, claiming the credit, and for adoption from foster care, that's the year that you finalize the adoption. I describe this sort of as being like, I'm a town crier. Hey, IRS, I adopted this child in 2021. I'm claiming this much, this $14,440 in adoption tax credit. You're claiming it. You're saying to the IRS, I am legally eligible for this credit. Your ability to use the credit is going to be limited by your financial circumstances. And technically on your tax form, it's going to be limited by your tax liability for the year. Tax liability for most people, it's the amount that you owe in federal income tax before regular credits are applied. And for most people have pretty boring taxes. I have fairly boring taxes. I have one credit. It's not the adoption credit. I have a different credit. But most people have pretty dang boring taxes. And if any of you have ever done your taxes by hand ever in your life, there's that point where you went through all that 1040, might have been the 1040 easy, and like my first job at Target when I was a teenager. You're getting through the thing and it says, here's your taxable income. You take this number and go to the tax tables with your filing status and come back with the number. That's what you owe in income tax, that number from the tax tables. For most people, that's all it is. It can be some other things. It can be alternative minimum tax added into there. It can be if you misestimated your income for the year and you have to repay some healthcare exchange premium or subsidies, that's going to get added in there. But for most people, it's that number from the tax table. That's what you owe in federal income tax, and that's what the adoption tax credit can reduce. So here's my base example. NACAC withholds $4,000 from my paychecks to pay my federal income tax. And when I complete my taxes, the tax table say, oh, $3,000 in income tax. I have no credits. I have no other taxes. So super boring, super vanilla. So what happens when I file my taxes, I get a refund of $1,000 that I overpaid. I paid in $4,000. I only owed $3,000. I get it back. It's sort of like if I'm buying something at Target that costs $4 and I give them a $5 bill. I mean, like anybody's using cash anymore, but let's say that happened. I give them a $5 bill. They're going to give me $1 back because that's my change back. That's what your refund is. Now, your refund can also include refundable credits, which the adoption tax credit isn't one now, but in our simplified example, I overpaid them. I get that refund at the end of the year. Now, the reason I use this example, and I was at least smart enough, I've learned a lot since I started doing this, but I was at least smart enough when I started doing this credit that I knew to do an example like this. There are people who think I get a refund, therefore this credit will never help me because I don't owe the IRS anything in taxes. That can be true. There are people who definitely fit that circumstances. I could have $1,000 withheld from my paychecks, go and do my taxes, and the tax table say, oh, $0, I get the same $1,000 back. And in which case I don't owe the IRS anything. That's why I got all $1,000 back. In this example, though, I owed them $3,000. I got $1,000 back because I had $4,000 withheld. So if I adopted and claimed 14,440 in adoption tax credit in 2021, because I adopted a child in 2021 who's considered determined special needs by the state, I would use 3,000 of that 14,440 in adoption tax credit to offset the 3,000 I owe. It wipes out all 3,000 that I owe, and now I would get all 4,000 that I had withheld. Plus, I would also get back any child tax credit. It's fully refundable this year, but with the advanced payments, I can't tell you, and it depends on the age of the child, but I would get that back too. Plus any other credits that I might have. Like if I was lower income, I might get the earned income tax credit. Now with the adoption tax credit, if I use 3,000 of it, I don't use 11,440 of the adoption tax credit, and that will carry forward like Thanksgiving leftovers to 2022. And then in 2022, I won't have any new credit. I'm not claiming any new credit. I can sell that property. I can file separately. Not a problem, because I'm only carrying it forward, but I'll have 11,440 in adoption credit left to 2022. So hopefully that helps explain sort of the question that was asked earlier. And we'll open up for some short, quick questions at the end too. So I've been talking about the adoption tax credit not being refundable. And as I showed on the last page, your ability to use it is limited by your tax liability. We at NACAC, and I know NFPA and Maryland Resource Parent Association, as well as other groups across this country, would like to see the adoption tax credit refundable again. If the adoption tax credit were to be made refundable again, that would be great news for everybody. If you want, I would say at this point, the best place to look is to go to our webpage. We are not the only people that host that, but we are part of the group that hosts the adoptiontaxcredit.org webpage. There's information there about how to take action and contact your members of Congress and encourage them to be co-sponsors of that legislation. The reason we want it to be refundable is there are low-income families. One of the first calls where this hit home with me was a Baltimore mom. She was a single mom making about $19,000 with 3 kids. She couldn't use a penny of this credit. She didn't make enough. So when I've looked at the IRS tax stats, they put them out. Generally, except for the 2 years it was refundable, generally families whose adjusted gross income is below $30,000 can't use the tax credit. And the reality is there are some families that are larger than that, or not larger than, that make more than that, who aren't able to use it either. Typically, it's because they have large families. The more children you have, generally, the harder it is to use this credit. Not for 2021, but in other years, it's a factor because of the child tax credit interaction. And I'll cover that more next year. Or you can check out, I don't know if Arnie still got my 2020 webinar, but I go into that a little more. But this year, it does not apply because of the child tax credit being fully refundable. So this is going to be your best chance. If you had taken this credit in 2020 and it didn't help you at all, it might help you this year if it did in prior years. Once again, depends on your financial situation and family size. So if you want to advocate for it to be refundable, go do that. Oh, going back to my last example. So let's say Congress made it refundable in 2022. And I know that the legislation makes the carry forward refundable. What would happen next year? Let's say everything else stays the same, that I have $4,000 withheld from my paychecks. The tax table say I owe $3,000. And the only other thing is I've got 11,440 in adoption tax credit, which is now all fully refundable. What would happen in 2022 is I get my normal 1,000 back, plus I would get all 11,440. So I would, if it became refundable, I would get 12,440. And if I had adopted a sibling group of 2, you would add 14,440 to that, because I would have 25,880 credit available for 2022. So larger adoptions, larger families definitely benefit greatly from the adoption tax credit being refundable. So for families who adopted in 2021, it's not refundable. Special needs adoptions do not have to have qualified adoption expenses. You can e-file. I'm not sure exactly why, but The most recent I've heard is March 3rd, which is in 2 days, is the earliest they will be accepting adoption tax credit, but that might be pushed back. I'm not sure what's going on there. And families should keep the records, as I mentioned earlier. Amending returns, if you are just learning about this adoption tax credit, but you didn't adopt in 2021, let's say you adopted in 2019, you're going to have to go back and amend your 2019 taxes to take this adoption tax credit. And then you're going to amend your 2020 if you don't use it all up in 2019. And then you're going to do your 2021, or if you've already filed your 2021, you're going to go back and amend your 2021 if you still have credit available to you. If you use software yourself, see if you can amend it using that software. I've been talking with someone, I can't remember, I think it was TurboTax they were using, and they had filed separately last year. Now they're going back and filing jointly and using the software to amend it. And it's going to be worth about $3,400 to them last year, and then this year will be about $8,500. And I think they adopted 2 kids, so they're starting to blend. So I might be wrong on the 2 kids, but regardless, they're doing well with using it, and they use software to do that. I personally, I use free software. You can shop around to see which you want, but check to see if you can use free software. I have jump shipped over the years. I used to use Tax Act, and then they started charging me for the one credit that I used, and then I switched. I paid that 1 year, and the next year I went to HR Block because it was totally free for state and federal. And then the year after that, they're going to charge me a lot for that one credit. And then I'm now on OLT, and they're not charging me for my one credit or federal or state. That's not a recommendation. I'm just letting you know that sometimes these softwares, as soon as you add a form, they might charge you if they otherwise were saying they were free, and shop around. I have never done the adoption tax credit with any of those, so I don't know exactly how it works. But I'm basically cheap. I want to keep those 30, 40 bucks, 50 bucks in my pocket. I don't want to, I e-file because I get a refund and I want to get that refund quicker. I don't e-file because I need the software to do the math for me. I'm not trying to brag that I'm like some super math genius, although it's pretty good. I use the software because of that, and I don't want to pay them if I can get away with it. So if you filed your return by hand, you will need to fill out Form 8839 and Form 1040X for the year you adopted, plus any subsequent years you are amending. If you're a family that doesn't generally file taxes, you're actually going to have to file a tax return for that year. Now, if you don't normally file taxes and the tax credit's not refundable, it's not probably going to help you unless we can make it refundable, in which case you would then go back and do it. But I wouldn't file taxes to get it in the system until you know you're actually going to get paid out for it. And if anybody has specific questions they don't want the whole group to know, or if they want to do a direct message to me, you can send a direct message in this chat and I can try to address it at the time, or you just follow up with me afterwards. Because, taxes are pretty personal things. So, and all I'm trying to do is help you make sure you can get maximum benefit you can and help understand your financial situation for you. I try to explain it as best I can. And I have, 18, 19 years of experience. So I think I do it better than average job. So for families who adopted in 2018 through 2020, same thing. Special needs you don't have to document qualified adoption expenses. It's not refundable. If you adopted in 2018 and you didn't take this tax credit before, you got to get that amendment for 2018 in by April 15th. The IRS does not let you go back more than 3 years. 2018 taxes were due April 15th, 2019. 3 years later is April 15th, 2020. If you filed early, you still have till April 15th. It's not like it's 3 years from when you file. If you did an extension, you have 3 years from the extension date that you filed, which can be as late as October 15th. But if you filed on time or early, you have till April 15th to not lose out. 2018 through 2020, the interaction between the child tax credit and the adoption tax credit is different. There's a portion of the child tax credit that gets used first before the adoption tax credit happens. If you're in this situation, it's easiest if you and I go over your taxes for those years. We can see how much you might benefit, and if it's worth going back and amending Yeah. So I'm happy to go over people's taxes with them. As I said earlier, keep your documentation. And if you do amend your returns for earlier years, you want to start with the first year, the year that generally you finalize the adoption, so you know how much carry forward to bring to the second year, if you have any, and then you would amend that year's taxes and so on until you use it up or you get to the current year. So for those who adopted in 2017 or earlier, right now, 2012 actually is now closed, and 2011 also is closed. If you adopted in 2013, your sixth and final year is 2018. So if you could carry some credit from an earlier year into 2018, the IRS has ruled that you can go back and amend those years. You don't get a refund for those earlier years, but any unused credit, they say you have to still use it like you would get a refund. If you have unused credit into 2018 and then you could get a refund in 2018, you're going to have to get that done by April 15th of 2022. And I can go over your tax with you. Some people will use it all up in the closed years. It's not worth doing. There's going to be a small number of people who adopted in 2013 where it could possibly work. I wouldn't know without knowing what's on your taxes to have a sense. The closer you are to 2018, the more likely it could actually be useful. But once again, that depends. Can you use it in 2018, 19, 20, or 21? That, you know, some folks, they're lower income, they're not going to be able to use much of anything. So once again, anybody who's going back, especially multiple years, it's probably better for us to go over your taxes together. So are there any, Artie, were there any questions you were saying related to the adoption tax credit? Because I'm about to move into the claiming kids as a dependent and then the recovery rebate credit.
No, I'm not seeing anything, Josh.
Okay, perfect. Well, if you have any more questions, just bring them up at the end because I'll just run through these two things. So to claim a child as a dependent, this is from IRS publication 501. And this is cut and pasted. It's not every part that's in there. It's the relevant sections for foster, adopt, kinship families. So relationship, there's 5 tests to claim a child as a dependent. This is claiming a child, a qualifying child. There's a qualifying relative, which are different rules. I don't know why any of you would be under the qualifying relative rules. If I don't think that would happen. You literally can't qualify for a qualifying child. Then you might qualify as a qualifying relative, but they're a little different. And if you're in that situation, reach out to me. But generally, you're looking at the qualifying child part. So first test is a relationship test. To meet this test, it must be your son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, or descendant of any of them, or your brother or sister, half brother, half sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or descendant of any of them. Adopted child is always treated as your own child. The term adopted child includes a child who is lawfully placed with you for a legal adoption. Foster child is an individual who is placed with you by an authorized placement agency or by judgment, decree, or other order of any court of competent jurisdiction. So generally, this is not a big issue. We generally, in states that are that families have to fight to get Social Security numbers to claim their foster children, we try and use this language to say, listen, the IRS clearly says that claiming a child, a foster child meets that. Why are you not giving us the numbers? And then there's the whole privacy issue thing that comes up. But we actually try and use the fact that the foster child is explicitly stated in the instructions to help try and make that case in states where that's challenging. The next 2 tests are the age test and the residency test. The age test, to meet this test, the child must be under the age of 19 at the end of the year, or a student under the age of 24 at the end of the year and younger than you, or permanently and totally disabled at any time during the year, regardless of age. The residency test, this is the biggest one for foster families who have not adopted a child yet. To meet this test, the child must have lived with you for more than half the year. A lot of people say 6 months and a day. We just finished with the short month. I say 183 days. In leap years, I say 184 days because it's more than half the year. 365 is, half is 182.5. So 183 is half. And 366, that's 183 is half. So 184 is more than half. There are exceptions for temporary absences, children who are born or died during the year, adopted or foster children. kidnapped children, and children of divorced or separated parents. Death or birth of the child. A child who is born or died during the year is treated as having lived with you for more than half the year if your home was the child's home more than half the time he or she was alive during the year. So the example I generally give is, let's say a child's born November 1st. November has 30 days, December has 31, that's 61 days. If I've had that child at least 31 of those days, I've had that child for more than half the year they're alive. That's the thing. People say 6 months in a year. They're like, well, a child's not even 6 months old yet, and it's clear the IRS clarified this maybe about a decade ago, but they got a lot more explicit with this language. It hasn't always been as explicit, but it has definitely been more explicit in the last probably about decade. Support test. This is the other one that can be a little confusing, especially if we've got any old timers on here. I've been around for a while, as you can tell. I've been helping people with this credit since 04, but I've been working at NACAC for 24 years. The support test, to meet this test, the child can't provide more than half of his or her own support for the year. Now, the old test, this is back 04, 05 is when this changed. The old test was you had to provide more than half the support to the child. And if you didn't, you couldn't meet this test and you couldn't claim that child. Now think about that. Let's say you've got a foster child, and I can't remember the exact rates here, but let's say you get $800 a month in foster care payments for that child. You would have to be spending another 801 to meet that test in the old test, not the new test. Right now, explicitly in publication 501, foster care payments provided by a state, county, or agency are support provided by the state, county, or agency, not by the child. They don't specifically say adoption assistance, but I know the New York Adoptive and Foster Family Coalition of New York, I believe, has gotten a letter saying that that should be treated similarly. But I don't know where that letter is at this point. But we would definitely, if someone were challenged on the support test, we would help raise a stink to get adoption assistance treated the same. So if you ever ran into that, we can't go to tax court for you or anything like that, but we definitely can try and use our IRS contacts to try and challenge what the IRS is saying, if that were to happen. So right now, foster care payments, and we assume adoption assistance payments are support provided by the state or the agency, not by the child. And so the support test should not be a problem. And in fact, since that support provided by someone else, the child would actually have to have more than that amount of support that they're providing themselves, plus any resources that the resource family is bringing to the child. So it's very unlikely that a foster or adopted child would not meet the support test. And then the last one is the joint return test. And I hope you don't have married children that you're getting, that you're fostering or, getting adoption assistance for. I mean, obviously, hopefully they'll get married someday. But, the ages we're talking about, they shouldn't be married and filing a joint return. The last thing I'll say about the support test, that support test, the support test for a qualifying relative I mentioned earlier, that is the old support test that you have to provide more than half their support. So if you see that language come up, the real battle we have, once again, you can reach out to me. The real battle is why are you saying it's a qualifying relative, not a qualifying child? Because that's probably what's happening if they're using the other support test, the old support test, which still exists for a qualifying relative, but not a qualifying child. So, all right, this probably isn't an issue, but I want to cover this. To get the child tax credit, which, for 5 and under this past year is $3,600. For 6 through 17, it was $3,000, fully refundable. It was great in 2021. Usually it's $2,000 for all ages and not fully refundable. But in either circumstances, this applies. To get that child tax credit, you have to have a social security number for that child prior to you filing for the child tax credit. Okay. So if you've got a really young child that doesn't have a social security number yet, and you want that child tax credit for that child, you need to not file until you get that social security number. And that includes doing an extension. So if if you're like, well, we're working on it, but we're not going to get it till the summer, file for that extension if you want all that money. If you don't, that's your call. This is the exact language from the IRS. You may not claim the child tax credit for a child with an ITIN. That's an I don't remember what the first I is. It's taxpayer identification number. I don't remember what the first I is. Individual, I think. Individual taxpayer identification number. The child must have a social security number to be a qualifying child for the child tax credit, additional child tax credit, refundable child tax credit, or the non-refundable child tax credit. If you don't have these, you're going to be limited to $500 in other dependent credit, and that will actually go before the adoption tax credit. It won't be refundable. Timing, the required social security number is one that is valid for employment and is issued before the due date of your 2021 return, including extensions. So if you want this credit, you need to, and you don't have a social security number for that child yet, you need to do this. Now that we're talking about social security numbers, I'm going to back up on one thing. Let's say your child already has a social security number. Let's say you adopted them in November, National Adoption Month, the big National Adoption Day in your county, and you adopted that child. And you're planning to update information with the Social Security Administration, either get a new number for the child or get the updated name if the name's changed from what priorly was filed with the Social Security Administration. But you haven't done it yet. Maybe you don't have the updated birth certificate, amended birth certificate to present to the Social Security Administration to update it. If you're filing for the adoption tax credit, you use what the Social Security Administration knows your child as, even if that's not what Vital Records in the state of Maryland knows your child as. So if it's the old name, old number, file it as that. Next year, if it's changed and updated with Social Security Administration, use the new one. It's not a problem. I've confirmed this with the IRS. They have access to the records. They can see the changes that happen. They have advised me, because the question came up, like, I haven't changed it yet and it will be changed before next year. Should we just, not file for it and then amend it later? And the IRS has explicitly told me, file for what's in the system now. Next year, do the new thing. It is not a problem at the IRS side of things. So just want to make that statement very clear. So recovery rebate credit line. This is going to be for anybody that took a child into their family last year that they didn't have or couldn't claim in 2020. So you might have gotten placement, like the first time I heard about this for 2020 was a family that took placement of 4 kids in December of 2019, and they're going to miss out on the first stimulus check because they couldn't claim the kids in 2019 because they only had them for the last month. They had a sibling group of 4, but they only had them 1 month. They couldn't meet the residency test. And what Congress did is too small a thing to like really tailor it for kids in the foster care system. But thankfully, in the wisdom of somebody in Congress, they did this recovery rebate credit. It also should apply to newborns. If you didn't get the stimulus check in 2020 or 2021, that was stimulus check was in March. It was $1,400 per child, per individual. If you did not get that for a child that you can claim on your 2021 taxes, you need to fill out the recovery rebate credit. The instructions are on line 30. And it doesn't hurt whoever got that stimulus check. So like if Arnie claimed that child in 2020 and I got placement of the child in 2021 and I can claim that child in 2021, but he got that stimulus check last March for that child because he rightfully claimed them in 2020, the IRS isn't going to go back and say, hey, Arnie, give us that $1,400 back. We need to give it to Josh. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is they're just going to say, oh yeah, you're claiming this child. We'll give you this check for $1,400 because you can claim that child that year. So if you have that situation where you didn't get that stimulus payment for a child, but you can claim them on your 2021 taxes, you need to fill out this recovery rebate credit on line 30. So, and I'm just going to skip over this. There's a website where you can check what it is. You probably got a letter. I know I got a letter saying how much we got in recovery or how much we got in economic impact payments. But yeah, this is just, I'm just repeating what I said there. The last two things, and then I'm going to open up for some questions. And I'll have my slide with my contact information up. The adoption subsidy, you don't put on your taxes. Same with foster care payments. There's some really rare cases where foster care payments could be taxable. Like if you're paid to keep an open home because you're an emergency foster care placement, or if you looked like you were a group home, like a lot of kids with difficulty of care, that you might have to pay some of those. If you are thinking you're in that situation, you can reach out to me and I can pull that exact language for you. But generally, you do not report this as your income. If you have a tax preparer who says, well, you can't claim your foster child unless you report that income, that is not accurate. It doesn't say that anywhere. That's someone who thinks something makes sense. That is not based on anything in law. Now, I just said that the adoption subsidy is not taxable income. Unfortunately, there are other government programs that do count adoption subsidy as income. Food stamps, school lunches counted as income. Section 8 housing only counts $480 per child per year as income. It looks like it's other income if you're filing for bankruptcy, unless it's Title 4E funded, in which case it looks like it isn't. And low income home energy assistance program, LIHEAP, it depends on the state. So I'd have to look up what your state does. You don't put it on FAFSA. So it all depends. And we have a fact sheet on our website about that. Or if you're looking at any of those programs and you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. But that is sort of it. So I am, here's my contact information.
Once again, next Josh will answer some questions, or like he said, if you want to contact him either through email or the phone number for his office, he's willing to talk to you individually. We'll take questions now, but the other thing, please just put your name and jurisdiction in the chat here as we end up this hour, and we will make sure your certificate of training is mailed to your resource home worker. So please put your name in the chat, and we thank you. And now the floor is open for questions. Anybody have any questions?
I think I brain burned everybody. A lot of information to get out in a short time. That's how sadly my trainings tend to go, is they're sort of information dumps.
Well, you also
I have information people want, so it's sort of the
other thing is, Josh, you always send me your slides, so we will post them. And if that other resource page that you mentioned, I'd be glad to post all that to our website under resources. So this PowerPoint presentation and the recording will be on the website in the next few days. And probably everybody's trying to get off here, Josh, so
that works for me.
To the president with the State of the Union. I know that's where you're headed next.
Actually, I'm doing virtual D&D with my university group. So,
oh, okay.
Yeah, they're all Canadian, so they don't really care so much about our State of the Union.
Okay.
Yep. Well, thanks everybody, and you know how to get a hold of me if you have any questions. And I look forward to that if you need
Just me. A lot of things in the chat saying very helpful. Thank you for all the information, etc. So we will go from there. And thank you, Josh. It's always a pleasure